Yours is also just audio.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today we've got a treat for you, as always, Nicole Moore. Nicole, welcome to the show. Thanks for making time for us today.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah. So I met Nicole last week, and she interviewed me for her really coolly named podcast, which is More to Love. So Nicole runs this. She's a guest on the. She's the host on this podcast. She's also an adoption lawyer. She works with Jean Tate, and she's, interestingly enough, also a certified life coach. So this thing, there's a cultural difference here, right? A number of cultural differences between here, us in the UK and you guys in the States. Number one, you guys are more into coaching. Number two, you guys are more into this kind of portfolio careers. But I have to say, the combination of lawyer and life coach is one that I have never come across before. And I think it's beautiful because it seems kind of quite opposite-y. But an adoption lawyer is obviously a specific, that's a lawyer. That's not a hard-assed lawyer that's going to be doing corporate M&A and mergers and acquisitions and tax law and all that sort of stuff. So I guess it's not quite as contradictory in your side.
Actually, I'll tell you why it's a lot alike. And I got into law just so I could practice in the field of adoption. I got a degree in journalism as my undergraduate degree from the University of Florida. And as I was deciding what to do with that degree, I learned that you could make a career either as a social worker or as a lawyer through helping build families through adoption. And the minute that I learned that, I was like, sign me up. What do I do? What do I have to get? Where do I have to go? So it wasn't really the law aspect that brought me to law school. It was the idea of helping people, because at the core, that's kind of one of my signature strengths. That's kind of where my passion lies. And so if I'm not doing kind of a service job where I'm connecting with other people, helping solve problems, then I'm not really satisfied. So, in the United States, some people say they're a lawyer. Some people say they're an attorney. Some people put Esquire on their name. Some people say counselor of law. And so the similarities are, I have counseled agencies. I have counseled adoptive parents. I've counseled birth parents, and I have done the legal work through counseling them on their end goal. And so through life coaching, I'm still helping. It's another way that I can help the non-adoption world. And really, if I'm helping, then I'm happy. I also, recently became a certified mediator, so I can help settle issues that arise in family law cases. And so all of these things kind of blend together in a purposeful, meaningful time spent on my career to help.
Fantastic. So the name of the podcast is Thriving Adoptees. And the question I love to ask is, what comes to mind when you hear this phrase, Thriving Adoptees?
So I love the word thriving because I often see it compared to surviving. I think a lot of people are, I see it as kind of a pendulum. Are they just surviving life? Are they just barely getting by? Versus the upswing of that, and the opposite side is thriving makes me think kind of living their best life, kind of using everything, all the tools that they've learned along their way to, just live a happy and meaningful life. That's what I think of when I think of thriving.
Yeah. And what do you think helps that happen?
I think that 50% of our well-being happiness, so to speak, is kind of a baseline. We're born with it. And I think about 10% is based on our life circumstances. And I think about the other 40% is really based on really, what do we want to make of this life? What are we here to do? What can we do to feel the most reward and fulfillment? And I think that 40% is really kind of up to us. So I think for me personally, doing a career or, more than one, job that provides me with purpose and fulfillment helps me thrive.
Yeah. Okay. And I didn't ask you why you were, so it was, sorry, I'm not saying this fluidly like a lawyer would, right? Like you'll be. You said it was adoption first, and where was I going to go? It was adoption through social work or adoption through lawyer. So why adoption then? So why was adoption the area?
So when I got my journalism degree, I really wanted to be a Oprah Winfrey type end goal. I wanted to interview people. I wanted to share really amazing stories with the world, stories of loss and triumph and overcoming, and just sided three-dimensional stories. So it turns out you got to do news if you want to be Oprah Winfrey. And so I got my first job at a news station, and it was very sensationalized. I did not like it at all. On the wall, it says, if it bleeds, it leads. They would, run a story if only one side called back. And I was waiting for 4 other sides of the story for it to be interesting. And, so I quickly learned that I was not going to make it in the news at all. It was not for me. It felt very yucky. There would be, one of my first assignments was a judge that had committed suicide in a park. And I'll never forget, the producer handed me a microphone as the wife was arriving on scene, and I was like, what? Like, I'm not going to interview, so I was like, okay, all signs point to this not happening. So I immediately wanted some feel good replacement. And it was suggested that I wanted to do something with handicapped people, with kids, or with pets. So my father said, why don't you go, to Jeannie Tate? She does something with kids and maybe adoption or something, and maybe volunteer there and see what your next move will be. And so I literally began to volunteer in her adoption agency that's also in-house with the firm. And in 2 weeks, I was hooked on the beauty of the adoption triad and how women that weren't ready to parent could bless these, other families that couldn't conceive children, and how the child was blessed because, so many people love them. And I just wanted to be a part of that world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. It all making sense. It all makes sense. Have you heard the commencement speech that Steve Jobs did? I think it was in Berkeley, I think. And he talks about everything making sense when you look back. So nothing, like we're sold on this idea, especially by people within the education system, that it's very linear and it's all planned out. We're sold the same kind of stuff by some consultants, by anybody trying to sell us stuff, right? They know that we're kind of like impatient to do stuff in the world. They know that we're unsure of what to do and stuff. And we don't know the next step. And they know that that's driving us slightly nuts. So they say to us, I was just where you were. And I went, and then so there's this big kind of oversell of empathy with the target buyer. And then I discovered, after years and years, then I discovered the 5 simple steps. And if you pay me, or if you spend time with me, then I'm going to tell you those. And it's all, everybody's got this kind of, everybody falls for that, right? Me included. I keep on falling that for a million times. Whereas what Steve Jobs says is, it only kind of makes sense when you look back. But we're in this predicament where we're trying to make stuff up. We're trying to make stuff happen. We're trying to predict where the dominoes will fall before the first domino has fallen, and that is also in parenting as well. I think
absolutely
in parenting, people get they know that we're tearing our hair out. They know that we want X. They know that we just want our kids to be happy. Then whether they're adopted kids, whether they're bio kids, whether they're both, whether they're transracial, whether they're infant adoptions, whether they're adoption foster, whatever it is, we just want the kids to be happy. It's doing our nut in that they're not. So we need to do it. And if you just follow these steps, and that's kind of the way that everything seems to be sold at the moment.
Yes, but I think that we learn very early on as parents, even within the first year, it's not a one size fits all. And, I remember going to, different pediatricians, and one would say the opposite as another. And here I am, well, I don't know anything about medicine, and I'm a lawyer, and if I want to know about something, I'm going to go to the professional. So why is this pediatrician saying this, and this pediatrician saying that, and this one's recommending this, and this one's recommending this, and these are polar opposites? And it very quickly learned that everyone has their own opinion and what worked for them, and that the best we can do as parents is take maybe what does resonate with us, or maybe try something that does work, but that what works for us is not what might work for our neighbor.
Yeah. So I've never heard that when you broke it down to 50% well-being, 10% circumstance, and 40% what we make of this life. I kind of like the fact that it's not all one or the other, right? I'm sure that it's or it's 3 things, and it's a mixture of all those things. Whereas most people will say, well, it's all about this one. So you said that the 40% of what we make of this life, it's up to us. So what have you learned in the if we put ourselves in the listener's shoes, and imagine that the listener is an adoptive parent, right? What is it that you've learned that would help the adoptive parents who are listening make the best possible fist of being an adoptive parent, being a parent?
So I have been practicing exclusive adoption law since I graduated law school in 2004. And so I have had the honor of working with so many amazing adoptive families and parents. And I would say, based on that experience, coupled with my own in raising a 10, almost 11-year-old, what I wish I had known is I spent so much time worrying. I just spent so much time worrying if I was doing the right thing, because there was so many options and there's so many choices, and I was overwhelmed by the amount of choices. And if you're going to do this or that, and researching the benefits, but then you have to decide if you're going to do this or that. And there's so much judgment and stigma on a lot of the parenting issues and choices. And I spent so much time worrying, am I doing the right thing? This is all on me. And if I screw up this kid, it's going to be my fault. So I better do the right thing. And I had this false belief that there was a right thing. And I just had to find it. I just had to find it because someone was telling people what to do and they had to be right. And now I would say that's not true. I don't think it is as easy as black and white. I don't think there is a right or a wrong way. I think that we instinctively as parents know what's best for our child. And I think that in early parenthood, adopted or not, we get so caught up in what the universe or the social media or the TV or the pediatricians or the other moms in daycare or the other kids in preschool are doing and saying that should I have him home or should I have him in preschool? Is that socialization or should I have the nanny? Or is the nanny going to do this? And should I breastfeed or should I feed him this? Or should I do this? Or am I not vaccinated? Should I vaccinate? It's so overwhelming when you have a new child. And I just think that so much of the worry can take away of the pure enjoyment of being with your child and your baby. And I would say, I don't think I got any benefit in worrying other than it might have led me to do more research. Sometimes doing more research made me more confused because it was all over the place. I can just say, like, looking back, we end up doing the right things for our kid, and the decisions that we make are usually, if they're coming from love, you're usually not going to screw them up. I remember, even talking to other people and saying, I just don't know if I'm doing it right, if I'm doing it right. And a lot of people would say the parents that are questioning if they're doing it right are the ones that are doing it much better than the parents that think that they know it all and they're doing it right. So I try to remind myself of that.
I love that, and I think that it to me it screams like a continuum, right? So the more wrong you think you're doing it, probably the more right you think you're doing
it. Exactly.
Because there must be degrees on that spectrum, and this is a bit of a strange one, but if we say that what I call what I do a business, and it's my baby, and I worry about my little baby just as much as people worry about their kids, probably.
Sure.
I heard you mentioned the word overwhelm there a lot, a couple of times, and I heard a great distinction from a mentor of mine: the difference between overwhelm and overload. Right. So overwhelm is when we've got too much going on in our heads, and I'm firmly in that camp. Right. So but I can laugh about it a little bit more than I used to do. And overload is when we're trying to do too much. And what I always when I'm talking, because I talk to a lot of parents, so I am. It never ceases to amaze me how overloaded they are. Right? They're a double whammy. So they're often overwhelmed, like you were talking about in yourself in the past, but they're also overloaded. But I think it's a really good distinction to make, because if you're overloaded, then you're going to need to try and do less.
Sure.
But if it's just an overwhelmed thing, if it's an overwhelmed thing, it's not quite as serious, although it clearly feels that way, right?
Sure.
I'm in that camp.
Sure. And I felt like, personally for me, my feeling of overwhelm leads to overload. And what I mean by that is I love to learn. I like to read about whatever it is that I want to learn to become more educated on it. I like to listen to podcasts about what I'm craving to learn. So what I saw myself doing and continue to do sometimes is if I wanted to learn, well, really, I have a choice in parenting or in life, and should I do this one or this one? Well, let me become educated about it. So the overload was reading books about it, listening to podcasts, going and hearing people talk about it. And that can be too much. I mean, like, there has to be a happy median, because I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about our kids. It's a part of loving them. And I'm not saying we shouldn't try to educate ourselves, because certainly that helped. But at what point will it be enough? Like, how many books do you have to read on the topic? How many podcasts do you have to listen to on the topic before you feel like you're doing the right thing?
About 7.2.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to write that down.
There's have you ever seen? There was the science fiction writer. I'm not sure. He's a British guy, and he wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think he's called Douglas Adams, right? And they're all looking for the meaning to life. And this is it's like a comedy. It's a book, and then it was a TV series, and I guess it was a film as well. But yeah, they're all looking for the meaning to life, and then somebody says, "I've got it. It's 42." So my 7.2 was inspired by that. So you talked about coming from love and instinct and intuition. For me, I hear this phrase a lot, okay, in the trauma training business. So the adoption world, post-adoption training seems to be, to me, a very psychologically focused world that is kind of obsessed with trauma. And people, well, before I say that, that's just my take on it. I don't know whether your researchers sent you looking at this stuff. But to what extent do you think that that's a fair reflection, or just Simon making stuff up?
You know, I speak to a lot of prospective adoptive parents about their fears of adopting. And I have to be honest, I do not hear the trauma inquiry as one of their concerns.
Okay.
I hear, what if the birth mom changes their mind? What if, she is doing a drug or an alcohol that we don't know about, and then, the child is born this way? What if she comes in, hunts us down like you see on a Lifetime show, and then she wants the baby back? But when I'm counseling with prospective adoptive parents, I don't hear, what type of trauma might my adopted child experience?
Okay. So here's where I think the distinction is then. And I'll get around to the coming from love thing, because it all fits in, right? I'm talking about training of parents who have already adopted and who are struggling.
Yes. Okay.
I'm talking about post-adoption. That post-adoption world seems to be very focused on trauma. To me, it seems to be almost obsessed with the trauma stuff.
So certainly you would have, I think, more of an insight to that, that kind of school of people, because I've done the legal work. I have finalized their adoption. And typically I keep in touch with tons and hundreds of adoptive parents, but typically if they're going to have some sort of trauma, they're not going to call their lawyer. They're going to call a therapist to deal with it. So I might not hear of it as much as you, but what I do hear in the world of even just, friends that have adopted, whether it's, ones I've done or not, it's always the go-to. So if the child is depressed when they reach their teenage years, well, maybe it's because of the adoption, or maybe it's because the parents were genetically oppressed, but it's always the go-to. Maybe, I had an adoptive parent call once and he said, well, my son is just he's just very violent. And I said, well, gosh, like, what does that look like? And he said, well, he's just like hitting people and biting people. And I'm like, how old is he now? And he's like, 4. I'm like, my brother went through a biting phase. He got kicked out of all these schools. Like, I don't think that has anything to do with adoption, but so I do feel like it's almost when things go wrong, they wonder if it's because of adoption. I don't hear them identifying the word trauma as a word associated with it. I hear more of keeping in touch with adoptees as they grow older. I hear more of abandonment issues. Yeah. But I do think there's a propensity when you have adopted a child, and I have many friends and close, people who have, to just worry whenever something happens that could be completely not related to adoption, and that if you had your biological child, just like my biological child is going through the same exact thing, yeah, that it's almost like, oh, well, is it because of this? Same way, perhaps divorced people, that the child has anxiety. Oh my gosh, it must be because we're divorced and this must be so hard for him, and it has to be because of this, and now our decision has, it's like, or maybe he's just struggling with anxiety. Yeah. So that's really what I see.
Okay. So I think there's a lot, if you look at the adoption of older kids, right, then obviously they've come from what they call kids from hard places. So they've been through there's been neglect, or there's been trauma, there's been chaos in the household or whatever. So that plays into it as well. But what a lot of, I'm a believer in being trauma informed, but hope obsessed. So whereas my take is that it's a trauma obsessed. And,
yes, and keep in mind too that I do 95% of infant placements.
Yes, of course.
95% of my work is infant placements. So I do think when you're talking about trauma, that you are talking about those older children placements, and maybe 12 different placements in a very short amount of time before they find their forever family.
Yeah. What I wanted to pick up on it is this. The mind is as a meaning making machine, right? So it's got like a it's got one of those when you're watching one of those films where there's where I'm thinking about Top Gun, where they've got a lock, they've got a missile lock on,
Yes.
The guy that my wife doesn't like, what's his name?
Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise, right? So he's got a lock on. He's got a lock on the bandit in front of him. So that's what our meanings, our minds are. They're looking for a meaning. They're locked onto meanings, and they're locked onto the meaning, and they are trying to shortcut circuit and simplify things. And that's what's behind the, adoption is the go-to reason for my 4-year-old being violent. Yes. So I'm talking about that because that's what minds do, right? So when we can realize that, when we can see for ourselves that mind, that reason-making machine, our mind, may actually be wrong.
Yes.
Because we're convinced, until we're convinced, we live in a belief-created world. Our beliefs, what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. Have you heard that? So it's like, once we've decided, that's it. This is definitely an adoption issue. So there's that. So just I'm laboring this for the listeners, just to perhaps make them aware that's what our minds do. And then the next thing I want to say about that is that, you're talking about worrying a lot. Well, we're both talking about worrying a lot. And there is and is it this or is it that? Should I do this? Should I do that? And one of the things that a lot of guests have said, adoptive parents have said on the show, is that they spend a lot of time. It's either this is definitely an adoption issue, this one I don't know, and there's a lot of time, a lot of brain power, kind of invested in trying to get to the bottom of whether this is an adoption issue or whether it isn't an adoption issue. And that consumes our brain and to the nth degree. And to me, it's a bit like a rabbit hole.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a bit, when I go through similar things in my head, well, when I go through to, when I'm looking at something, when I'm standing back from my reaction, and I'm thinking, well, is this an adoption thing? And do you know, it can only be 55 years after I've been adopted. 55 years after I was adopted. It can only be a thought thing. It can only be what I'm thinking in the moment. It's not the event 55 years ago. It's the meaning I'm giving it. And more often than not, well, no, more often that's right. A lot of the time, my thoughts and my predictions and the meanings that I draw are incorrect. So I am less. I hold my beliefs. I try to hold my beliefs a little less tightly, a little less firmly. So we have this phenomenon. I don't know where you have it in the US or not. It's called grumpy old man syndrome. This is a thing that grumpy or angry, and I'm thinking of an American gentleman at the moment who I'm not going to name, but it's people that are very, very sure
and set in their ways.
They're very sure. They're set in their ways. Yeah. So they're set in their ways. They're set in their ways. And this is a funny one. Their mind is set. We think of that word mindset. What are we talking about? Concrete here? We've got neuroplasticity, which Absolutely. Is how the brain changes, right? But then we've got this other thing called mindset. So I'd prefer to have mind fluid. I'd prefer, if I was given the choice between mindset and mind fluid, but we use this word mindset, and mindset, a set mind drives us to be set in our ways, right? So I try to hold my beliefs a little bit lighter than I do, and try to go the opposite way, which is as most blokes in the UK get older, they get more set in their ways, and definitely more set in their thinking. I'm pretty set in some of my ways, actually, my routines. That's what I'm thinking. But in terms of my mind, what I'm looking to do all the time is like yourself. I'm listening to podcasts to challenge my beliefs, in the belief that that's going to make me more flexible, and if I'm more flexible, I'm going to have more success in doing what you want to do. In terms of, you said I'm happiest when I'm helping. Me too. So I'm thinking, well, if I'm more flexible in my ways, then I'll reach more adopted parents and adoptees by the podcast. So I don't know what you make of all that. That was quite I'm supposed to be talking to you, asking you questions, but I went off a bit of a ramble there.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And so this is what I wonder. I wonder if the adoptive parents that are struggling and worrying and saying, is this adoption or not? To me, maybe they don't have this belief. Like we're talking about set beliefs, right? I think this and that's what I think it and it is. But maybe they don't have a belief on it. Maybe they are truly questioning it. Is it adoption or not? Which then leads me to think, does it matter? Right? So does it matter if it's adoption or not? And is it because you want to know because having an answer is really what you're seeking? Or do you want to know because if it's adoption related, then you're going to go to an adoption professional versus if it's just something else, you're going to go to a non-adoption, so at the core, I do think sometimes we question things. Is this because of this? Is this because of this? Is this because of this? Because we want this narrative. We want this explanation. But at the end of the day, does it matter if it's adoption related or not? How are you going to deal with it?
Well, from my own perspective, I felt when I read that Primal Wound book, and I thought, oh, this explains everything. But then, because, okay, so everything is, it's determining everything in my life, pretty much, right? That's one the note, I believe. And there was a sense of elation there, right? So when people get a diagnosis, or they get, there's an elation. Oh, I finally, because the search is over.
Yep.
The search is over.
Yep.
But then for me, then I was in the prison, because I can't go back and unadopt myself.
That's right.
I can't go back in time, and therefore where I was at that point was I was totally disempowered, and I talk about this a lot. I don't know if I mentioned it to you on the when we spoke last week, because I use an idiom to describe this. So, have you ever been in the swimming pool or the sea with a ball and tried to, like a plastic soccer ball and tried it, or beach ball, and tried to push it down under the water?
Yes.
Yeah. So you push it down, you might push it down a foot, and the water fights you, and it fights you to the extent that when you let go of the ball, it jumps up 2 foot. So it's only on, it bounces. Sorry, no bounces, because it's not hitting the ball. It rises higher than it fell. So that is what happened to me. So this kind of the disempowerment, blaming everything on adoption, took me down because I believed that couldn't be altered. And then when I realized that actually it's a human, what I'm going through are human things, not adoption things. And they are thought in the moment things, because this is 50 years after the adoption happened. It's not actually the physical reality that I'm going through at the moment. That's when the ball bounced higher. And then that got me into a much better place to make a difference in the world, because I felt I no longer felt disempowered. I no longer felt, so if that ball, right, it wasn't a beach ball or a plastic soccer ball, if it was like a ball and chain, like they used to attach to prisoners' legs, right, and to prisoners' legs, then I was no longer dragging around a ball called adoption anymore, which would slow down my progress. I couldn't walk with it. You have to pick them up, don't you? And it's going to make you slow. And that's what it felt like to me. So if we are blaming everything on, on any one thing, then we're kind of disempowered. We're disempowered by that.
I love that visual representation. I mean, I know we used a lot when we talked last week, but I love that visual representation. And I even see it like, you know, when you feel hopeless and powerless and like, you know, you can't do anything about it and you're under the water, that also, you're probably suffocating and inhaling water and drowning. And if it bounces up because you let go of the ball and you let go of the belief that it's irrevocably, you know, irrevocably going to negatively affect you, then the ball goes what? Up to the sunlight, up to the fresh air, up to not being, you know, being held underwater. I think that's such a powerful visual representation.
So I've got a question for you on the back of that, though. And sometimes I've got an answer to questions and sometimes I haven't. I've got an answer. I've got my own take on this, but I'm really interested to hear what you think. So if it's not adoption in the sense of the stuff that I've just said to you, so I'm asking you to put your kind of life coach hat on now, right? If it's not adoption, what is it?
The human experience.
Yeah.
I just think the what is it is not as important, or why is it is not as important as what you do with it and how you view it and where you go from there.
Yeah. So my answer to that question is kind of like a subset of yours. The human experience, and before I launch into that, something that's just popped into my head. Basically, it was a conversation I had at lunchtime today, and I was talking about somebody having a fear of flying. Right? They have the fear of flying before they get on the plane. So it's not the plane, it's not the flying. It's about the thought of flying. We're afraid of our thoughts rather than afraid of our circumstances. Does that? To me, that's quite a big distinction, but it can sound, I think the first time I heard it, it was like, well, you're just splitting hairs, Simon. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, I think about it if we're relating it to adoption, and it kind of is like the thought of, so it's not adopting because you know you want to adopt, you've been waiting for forever, you've done all your research and your education on adoption, but you're scared of the process, or you're scared of the unknown, or you're scared just to be a parent, even though, you know, arguably it's not becoming a parent because that's what you ultimately want, but it's the worries that come along with it.
If I could put it, this sounds far too simple, right? And we're afraid of our thoughts, we're not afraid of our circumstances. So we're afraid of our worry. So if we're projecting our child not making it to college, right? Okay. So that hasn't happened. It's
right.
They're still 14. You know.
That's right.
So, but we're afraid. The worry is driven by our thought in the moment, 100%. Not the actual circumstance. You know, we're yeah. So you said the human experience. That's what's happening. Now you mentioned. Did I mention this book last time? A book. There's a guy called David Hawkins wrote a book called Power versus Force. Did I mention that to you?
No.
So it's a scale of human consciousness. So what that means is it's a ladder of our emotions, and we are going up and down that ladder all the time. So shame is right down at the bottom of the ladder. Anger is a bit further up. Pride is a bit further up above that, and love is a bit further. And that's what's happening. So I'm going up and down the ladder. We're all going up and down the ladder. My mood has been up and down since the adoption 55 years ago, right? So a fixed event cannot cause a variable experience. So I mean, my experience has varied. So what's been happening is my mood has been going up and down, and this is, you know, and the human experience is that.
Correct.
And this guy David Hawkins has just kind of catalogued it in a way, and I often mention the book because that's what's happening. You know, the thoughts in our heads, the feelings in our hearts, they're constantly shifting from, you know, what we're going to have to dinner, what happens if my adopted child keeps on lashing out. We're afraid and we're worried that's driven by what's going on in our head at the moment.
I agree.
So I'm just conscious of time. What's the question I've not asked you? Or what would you like to share on this theme that I haven't kind of that we haven't had opportunity to share so far?
I would say that, you know, you can do your homework and you can, you know, get educated on adoption, specifically adopting an older child, and you can speak to other people that have had experiences in doing that before. But at the end of the day, you're going to know what's right for your child, and there's not going to be one book or one person or one speaker that's going to give you the golden key that answers the how. You're just going to find your way through trial and error, and you can lean on experts for help. But, you know, at the end of the day, if, you know, we all have our own struggles and crosses to bear. So if it's not one thing, it's another. It's a part of life. And so I would just say, have a great village of support, and just have, I guess, a faith that, you know, things work out in the end.
Yeah. And I love that word faith, right? Because for me, you know, I have a slight concern that the psychologists and psychiatrists are taking over the world. And psychology used to have a lot more, it used to have a spiritual side to it. And that got stripped away, and then it became about behavior, and then it became about thoughts and feelings, right? But it didn't have that kind of, it no longer has that, from what I can tell. So I know a lot of psychiatrists, right, who have been classically trained and found it didn't work, found that traditional shrinking didn't work, and they've moved to something that is more, has a more spiritual, a more intuitive, a more faith is not, I'm not talking about religious here, right? But I'm talking about faith. I'm talking about that side of us, the kind of the more left brainy side than the right side, and had far more success and built their practices on the basis of the success that they've had with their clients, without traditional shrinking. They have to have the traditional shrinking qualifications to get into the field, but they don't. They move to a slightly different place that's more about, you know, who we are rather than what we think, right? Because the psychiatrists are obsessed with how we think. Mm-hmm. Well, we're not our thoughts, so the answer's for me upstream in who we are, mm-hmm. not what we think or how we feel. Kind of go. When our feelings go, we're still left behind. When our thoughts come and go, we're still left behind. So anyway, I'm being perhaps a little bit too abstract at this point. And yeah, just one last thing I want to say about the trauma, coming from love and doing the research, coming from love, because what the trauma people say, love isn't enough. So yes, we but coming from love, rather than, there's a difference between coming from love and relying on love to solve our problems for us.
Precisely.
Yeah. Beautiful. So in the show notes, as always, listeners, there's going to be links to Nicole's employer, and especially her podcast, because you're going to want to check out More to Love. And it's a play on words, right? She's Nicole Moore, so More to Love's got 2 O's in it, just in case. Yeah, I haven't figured that out. I just thought I sounded really patronising there. That was me trying humour. Okay, sorry, listeners, that was me trying humour. You see why I don't try and do it too often. So check out More to Love, and there's some great. I listened to a couple of the episodes. Don't bother with the episode from me, because you've
yes. Everybody wait for the March 2022 episode with Simon.
No, don't bother about that one. Go and listen to somebody else. Thanks a lot, Nicole. You've been an absolute star. I have loved this.
Thank you, Simon.
Speak to you soon, listeners. Bye-bye.